He forgot the woman who once became the safest place in his world, but his heart was about to remember what his mind never could. The steady rhythm of the cardiac monitor echoed through the private recovery suite as pale morning light spilled across the polished hardwood floor of St. Vincent Medical Center in downtown Chicago. Dominic Castellano slowly opened his eyes, his vision blurred by soft white ceilings and unfamiliar faces moving quietly around him. The scent of antiseptic lingered in the cool air, replacing the cedar and espresso aroma that had filled his penthouse every morning for years. His fingers twitched against the crisp hospital blanket before reaching outward, searching for something he could not name. Standing silently beside the window, Naomi Carter tightened her grip around a worn leather handbag that had seen better days. Her dark eyes shimmered with emotions she had promised herself she would never reveal again. For 6 long months, she had stayed away from the Castellano estate, believing distance was the final gift she could give the man she had once protected with every quiet sacrifice. Then one unexpected phone call had changed everything. The family physician had asked for her personally, explaining that Dominic had survived a terrible accident but awakened without memories of the past 3 years. 3 years. Exactly the years that held every secret she had buried inside her heart. Dominic's breathing grew steadier as he stared toward the ceiling, confusion replacing fear. The doctor spoke gently, explaining where he was, what had happened, and why so many familiar faces suddenly felt like strangers. Dominic listened politely, nodding with the calm discipline of a man accustomed to remaining composed even when the world shifted beneath him. Then, without warning, his eyes drifted across the room until they settled on Naomi. For a brief second, time itself seemed to hesitate. His expression softened with an instinct he could not explain. His hand slowly lifted toward her before stopping halfway, as though reaching for someone he almost remembered from a forgotten dream. Naomi felt every beat of her heart echo inside her chest. She wanted to run to him. She wanted to tell him that she had once been the person who knew exactly how he took his coffee, why thunderstorms kept him awake, and which old jazz record always calmed him after impossible days. She wanted to tell him that his son still carried the little wooden toy they had repaired together one rainy afternoon. She wanted to tell him that leaving had broken her more than staying ever could. Instead, she remained perfectly still. Dominic offered a warm but uncertain smile. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice weaker than she had ever heard it. "Have we met before?" The room became impossibly silent. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a moment before finding the strength to look back at him. Every truthful answer gathered behind her lips, waiting to escape. Yet another promise, made long before this hospital room existed, held them prisoner. She returned his gentle smile with one that concealed an ocean of grief. "No, sir," she answered softly. "I don't believe we have." Dominic nodded politely, accepting her words without question, but something deep inside him refused to agree. He could not explain why the sound of her voice quieted the pounding inside his head, or why the sight of her standing near the window filled him with an unfamiliar sense of peace. His memories had disappeared, yet somewhere beneath the silence, his heart was already beginning to recognize the one person determined to remain a stranger. The next morning, the city skyline shimmered beyond the hospital windows as Chicago slowly awakened beneath a blanket of pale autumn clouds. But inside Dominic Castellano's private suite, time seemed to move according to an entirely different rhythm. Every visitor carried stories he no longer remembered. Every familiar voice belonged to someone who felt strangely new. And every photograph placed beside his bed looked like pages torn from another man's life. His younger sister, Isabella, patiently explained names and faces while physicians assured him that memories sometimes returned in fragments instead of all at once. Dominic listened with quiet respect, absorbing every detail without complaint, yet one question remained buried. Beneath every conversation, why did the woman with warm brown eyes feel more familiar than anyone else in the room? Outside the suite, Isabella found Naomi standing alone near a coffee machine, staring at the untouched paper cup warming her hands. "He trusts you," Isabella said softly, "even if he does not understand why." Naomi lowered her gaze. "He deserves people who belong in his future, not someone from a past he cannot remember." Isabella sighed before taking a slow breath. "The doctors believe routine may help. Familiar faces, familiar voices, Familiar habits. You know him better than anyone here. Naomi immediately shook her head. He does not know that anymore. Isabella stepped closer. That does not change the truth. Hours later, after speaking with the physicians and the family, Naomi reluctantly agreed to return, not as someone from Dominic's past, but simply as a private caregiver helping during his recovery. The decision felt heavier than any suitcase she had ever carried into the Castellano estate years before. She had promised herself she would never walk through those gates again. Yet life had quietly rewritten every promise she had made. 2 days later, a black luxury sedan rolled through the familiar iron entrance as golden leaves drifted across the long stone driveway. The mansion stood exactly as Naomi remembered, elegant and timeless beneath the morning sun, but every familiar corner awakened memories she refused to revisit. The marble foyer still reflected sunlight like polished water. The grandfather clock still chimed every hour with perfect precision. Even the scent of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen felt unchanged. Only Dominic was different. He greeted her with the same polite smile he had offered in the hospital. "Welcome," he said warmly. "They tell me you know this house better than I do." Naomi answered with a small smile. "You will remember your ways soon enough, sir." He laughed softly. "I hope so. Yesterday, I opened 3 wrong doors before finding my own office." The humor sounded genuine, but behind it lingered frustration he tried hard to hide. Throughout the afternoon, Naomi quietly returned forgotten routines to the household without drawing attention to herself. She adjusted the living room curtains before sunset because bright evening light always gave Dominic headaches. She placed a glass pitcher of lemon water on the library table because he rarely remembered to drink enough during long afternoons. She replaced fresh lilies in the hallway with white orchids because lilies always made him sneeze, even though he had forgotten that simple fact himself. Dominic noticed every change without realizing why each one felt exactly right. As evening settled over the mansion, he paused outside the kitchen and watched Naomi preparing herbal tea with calm, practiced movements. She measured each ingredient without hesitation, stirring slowly before placing the cup on the tray exactly as she had done countless times before. Dominic frowned gently, overcome by a strange sensation that tightened somewhere deep inside his chest. "That smells familiar," he murmured almost to himself. Naomi froze for the briefest moment before setting the spoon aside. "Perhaps someone made it for you before." Dominic continued watching the steam rise from the porcelain cup. "Maybe," he answered quietly. "Or maybe someone used to care about me more than I ever realized." 3 days passed, and the mansion gradually settled into a quieter rhythm, one shaped not by forgotten memories, but by instincts that refused to disappear. Dominic followed every recommendation from his doctors with disciplined determination, reading reports, attending therapy sessions, and walking the estate every afternoon, hoping that one familiar corner might unlock the missing pieces of his life. Nothing dramatic happened. No sudden flashes. No overwhelming revelations. Instead, something far more mysterious unfolded. His heart continued recognizing what his mind could not explain. Every morning, without thinking, Dominic left his bedroom and walked directly toward the east terrace instead of the dining room. The first time it happened, he looked around in confusion, surprised to find himself standing beside the same stone railing overlooking the gardens. "Was I looking for something?" he quietly asked. Naomi, who had just arrived, carrying a small breakfast tray, answered gently, "Perhaps you simply enjoy the sunrise." Dominic studied the golden light stretching across the trees before smiling faintly. "It feels like I have stood here 1,000 times." Naomi lowered her eyes because he had. Almost every morning before the accident, he had spent 10 peaceful minutes on that terrace while she quietly placed his coffee beside him without interrupting the silence he treasured. Later that afternoon, Dominic wandered into the library searching for a financial journal. Hundreds of carefully arranged books lined the walnut shelves, yet his hand moved with unexpected certainty. Without reading a single title, he reached toward the highest shelf and pulled out the exact volume he wanted. He stared at it in disbelief. "How did I know where this was?" he whispered. Naomi watched from across the room while dusting a nearby cabinet. Sometimes habits remain even when memories fade. Dominic nodded slowly, but another question settled into his thoughts. "Then why do so many of those habits seem connected to you?" Naomi nearly dropped the polishing cloth before forcing herself to remain calm. I only help where I can, sir. He accepted her answer, yet something inside him remained unconvinced. That evening, rain clouds gathered over Chicago, covering the estate in soft gray shadows. A low rumble echoed across the sky. Dominic instinctively stopped reading and looked toward the tall windows. His breathing became slightly uneven, although he could not understand why. Naomi quietly crossed the room without saying a word. She closed the curtains halfway, turned on the warm table lamps instead of the bright ceiling lights, and placed a cup of chamomile tea beside his chair. She never asked if he needed anything. She simply knew. Dominic wrapped his hands around the warm porcelain cup and felt the tension inside him slowly dissolve. How did you know this would help? He asked. Naomi hesitated before answering. Everyone has small comforts. Dominic looked directly into her eyes. No, you knew before I did. His words lingered between them as rain tapped gently against the windows. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Finally, Dominic broke the silence with an embarrassed laugh. This is going to sound strange. Naomi waited patiently. Ever since I woke up, I keep having the same dream. I never see a face. I only hear someone humming while making tea. Every time I hear that melody, everything feels safe. Naomi felt tears threaten to return, but she quietly turned toward the window before he could notice. The melody he described was the lullaby her grandmother had sung throughout her childhood, the same tune she had unconsciously hummed while working in the mansion for years. Dominic stared into the swirling steam rising from his cup, completely unaware that the woman standing only a few feet away had been the voice inside every dream he could no longer remember. The following week unfolded with quiet routines that looked ordinary to everyone except the two people living inside their invisible weight. Every sunrise found Naomi preparing breakfast before the rest of the household stirred awake, and every morning Dominic somehow arrived in the kitchen only seconds before she finished pouring his coffee. Neither of them mentioned the strange coincidence anymore. It had become another silent mystery woven into the fabric of each day. Dominic often caught himself watching Naomi from across the room, not because he remembered her, but because every instinct insisted that losing sight of her felt strangely unsettling. He had spent his entire life trusting logic over emotion, yet logic failed him whenever she was near. One crisp Saturday afternoon, while organizing old files in his study, Dominic discovered a wooden music box tucked inside the bottom drawer of an antique cabinet. Its polished surface carried the gentle marks of age, and a tiny brass key rested beside it. Curious, he wound the mechanism. A delicate melody floated into the room, soft and familiar, filling every corner with quiet warmth. Before he understood why, a sharp ache pulsed behind his eyes. His breathing slowed. Somewhere deep inside his mind, sunlight flashed across a garden bench. A woman laughed. A porcelain teacup rested on a marble table. Then the images vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Dominic pressed his fingers against his temple. Why does this song feel like home? He whispered. Naomi had entered the room carrying freshly folded linens, but the melody stopped her in her tracks. Her face lost all color. Years earlier, Dominic had discovered that very music box at a neighborhood antique shop after hearing Naomi absent-mindedly hum the same tune while arranging flowers in the library. He had smiled and quietly purchased it without telling her. Everyone deserves one sound that reminds them life can still be gentle, he had said when he surprised her with the gift on her birthday. She had treasured those words far more than the music box itself. Dominic looked toward her with quiet curiosity. Have you heard this before? Naomi forced herself to breathe evenly. It sounds like many old music boxes. Dominic nodded, though disappointment crossed his face. I was hoping someone could explain why it feels important. Naomi carefully placed the folded linens onto a nearby chair before answering. Some memories are patient. They come back only when they know we are ready. Dominic studied her for several seconds. You always answer questions like you already know the ending. Naomi smiled faintly. Life has taught me that rushing the truth rarely helps anyone. Her words lingered long after the conversation ended. That evening, Dominic wandered through the estate gardens alone beneath rows of maple trees glowing with brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Cool autumn air carried the scent of fresh earth and distant rain. He eventually stopped beside an old wooden bench overlooking the small lake at the edge of the property. Without thinking, he sat in the exact place he had occupied countless evenings before the accident. His hand slowly brushed across the weathered armrest until his fingertips found something carved into the wood. 2 simple letters, D and N. He stared at them in silence. He did not remember carving them. He did not remember who had stood beside him. Yet the sight filled him with an overwhelming sense of longing. At that very moment, Naomi watched quietly from the mansion porch, hidden behind a stone column. Tears warmed her eyes as memories returned with perfect clarity. It had been Dominic who carved those initials one peaceful evening after thanking her for never asking anything in return for her kindness. He had smiled and made her promise one impossible thing. If life ever takes my memories away, he had told her with complete sincerity, do not let me stay beside you because I feel obligated. If I ever find my way back to you, let it be because my heart chooses you all over again. The carved initials remained in Dominic's thoughts long after the evening faded into night. He returned to the mansion carrying questions that refused to leave him, and for the first time since the accident, he stopped accepting uncertainty as enough. Every room seemed to whisper that something important had happened there. Every familiar object carried a meaning that remained just beyond his reach. The next morning, while the household quietly prepared for another ordinary day, Dominic made a decision. If his memories would not return on their own, he would patiently follow every small clue they had left behind. He began with the oldest members of the staff, people who had served the Castellano family for decades. Most answered politely but cautiously, respecting both his privacy and Naomi's silence. They spoke about business meetings, family holidays, birthdays, and quiet evenings on the terrace. Yet whenever the conversation drifted toward Naomi, their expressions softened in ways Dominic could not ignore. The elderly groundskeeper smiled warmly before saying, Miss Carter always noticed what everyone else overlooked. The housekeeper simply added, some people leave fingerprints on furniture. She left kindness in every room. Neither explanation satisfied him, but both deepened the mystery. That afternoon, Dominic wandered into the family sunroom where his 8-year-old son, Lucas, sat quietly assembling a wooden model sailboat across the coffee table. The boy looked up with a bright smile. Dad, Miss Naomi says you used to build these with me every Sunday. Dominic knelt beside him, carefully examining the tiny wooden pieces. I wish I remembered. Lucas nodded thoughtfully before reaching into a small storage basket beneath the table. You do not remember this either? He handed Dominic a faded photograph. It showed Lucas laughing while holding the very same model sailboat years earlier. Dominic stood behind him with one arm resting proudly on his son's shoulder. Naomi stood beside them both, smiling with gentle warmth while wearing a simple blue cardigan. There was nothing unusual about the picture except one detail that immediately captured Dominic's attention. He was looking at Naomi instead of the camera. Not casually, not politely. His expression carried complete trust, quiet admiration, and a peace he had never seen in his own reflection since waking in the hospital. Dominic continued staring at the photograph long after Lucas returned to his project. Who took this? He finally asked. Aunt Isabella, Lucas answered. She said it was my favorite day because everybody laughed the whole afternoon. Dominic carefully traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. Were Miss Naomi and I close? Lucas tilted his head with the innocent honesty only children possess. I thought everybody knew. Dominic looked up. Knew what? Lucas shrugged. Whenever I got scared during storms, I always looked for both of you because you were always together. Before Dominic could ask another question, Naomi appeared quietly at the doorway carrying a tray of fresh lemonade. She noticed the photograph immediately, and her footsteps slowed almost to a stop. Dominic held it toward her. Lucas says this was his favorite day. Naomi smiled gently. It was a beautiful afternoon. Dominic searched her face for answers. Every time I discover another piece of my past, somehow you are standing beside me. Naomi placed the glasses onto the table before meeting his eyes with remarkable calm. Sometimes life places people in the same chapter for a very long time. Dominic lowered the photograph, but never looked away. Then why does it feel like everyone knows our story except me? Naomi's heart tightened beneath the weight of the promise she still carried. She wanted nothing more than to tell him that every smile in that photograph had been real, that every peaceful afternoon had quietly transformed 2 lonely lives forever. but instead she offered only the one truth she believed she was still allowed to give. Because some stories cannot be understood until every missing page finds its way home. The questions Dominic carried no longer felt like passing curiosities. They had become quiet companions following him through every hallway of the estate, appearing in every conversation, every photograph, and every unexpected silence. He stopped searching for dramatic answers because he had begun to realize that the truth was hiding inside ordinary moments. It was not the grand events his memory had forgotten that fascinated him most. It was the countless little things that everyone else seemed to accept without explanation. One cool afternoon, Dominic stepped into the mansion kitchen earlier than usual. The aroma of fresh rosemary and roasted vegetables filled the warm space, while sunlight streamed through the tall windows above the farmhouse sink. Naomi stood at the counter preparing dinner with the same calm confidence she brought to everything she did. Before she could reach for the seasoning, Dominic quietly crossed the room and handed her the small glass jar resting on the highest shelf. They both froze. Naomi had never asked for it. Dominic slowly looked at the jar in his hand, then back at her. "How did I know which one you needed?" Naomi answered carefully. "Perhaps you guessed." Dominic smiled faintly. "No, that did not feel like guessing." Neither of them spoke again until footsteps entered the kitchen. It was Samuel, the elderly butler who had served the Castellano family for nearly 40 years. He watched the scene unfold before offering an almost invisible smile. "Old habits have remarkable patience, Mr. Castellano," he said before quietly excusing himself. Dominic noticed the expression on the old man's face. It was not surprise. It was recognition. Later that evening, Dominic found Samuel arranging silverware in the formal dining room. "May I ask you something?" he said. Samuel nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir." Dominic hesitated before speaking. "Everyone looks at Miss Carter differently. My sister trusts her completely. Lucas smiles differently whenever she enters the room. Even you seem to know something that nobody will explain." "What?" Samuel carefully placed the final fork beside an empty plate before answering. "Because respect cannot be hidden forever." Dominic frowned. "That is not an answer." The old butler looked toward the chandelier above them, as though searching for words worthy of the truth. "Many people earn gratitude because of one extraordinary moment. Miss Carter earned ours through 1,000 ordinary ones. She noticed sadness before anyone spoke. She solved problems before they became burdens. She never asked to be thanked." Dominic remained silent. Samuel continued gently. "Some people arrive in a house to work. Others quietly become part of its foundation." Before Dominic could respond, Samuel politely excused himself, leaving behind another piece of a puzzle that still refused to reveal its full picture. The following morning, Dominic drove with Lucas to the small private academy the boy attended. As they walked through the front entrance, one of Lucas's teachers recognized them immediately. "Mr. Castellano," she said warmly, "it is wonderful to see you recovering so well." Dominic smiled politely. "Thank you." The teacher looked around with quiet curiosity. "Miss Carter could not come today?" Dominic blinked. "You know Naomi?" The woman laughed softly. "Know her? She volunteered here every Thursday afternoon for nearly 2 years. She helped children with reading, organized school events, and somehow remembered every student's birthday." Dominic turned toward Lucas, who nodded enthusiastically. "She always stayed after I finished class so we could all go home together," the boy said. Dominic stood speechless. Naomi had never mentioned any of it. That evening, after returning to the estate, he found her watering white roses beside the garden path as the setting sun painted the sky with shades of amber and crimson. He walked slowly toward her, carrying nothing except one question that had grown impossible to ignore. "Why does everyone tell me who you are for other people?" he asked quietly. "But you never tell me who you were to me." Naomi looked at the fading sunlight reflecting across the roses before answering in little more than a whisper. "Because the only answer that truly matters is the one your own heart deserves to remember." The conversation beside the rose garden lingered in Dominic's mind long after the evening settled over the estate. He had stopped believing that memory alone would give him the answers he sought. The truth had been carefully protected by everyone around him, especially by the one person who seemed to deserve recognition the least because she never reached for it. Late the following afternoon, while searching for a property deed inside the family archives, Dominic unlocked a storage room that had remained untouched for months. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight filtering between the shutters, illuminating shelves filled with carefully labeled boxes dating back decades. He scanned each label until one caught his attention. Personal correspondence. Something urged him forward. Inside the box rested old notebooks, greeting cards, and several sealed envelopes tied together with a faded navy ribbon. None appeared secret or dramatic. They looked like ordinary pieces of an ordinary life. Yet one cream-colored envelope immediately stood apart because his own name was written across the front in graceful handwriting. Dominic carefully unfolded the letter. It had never been mailed. The paper had yellowed slightly with time, but every word remained perfectly clear. Dear Dominic, if you are reading this, then I have probably already left the estate. Please do not spend time looking for me. You once told me that kindness should never become a debt another person feels forced to repay. I believed you then, and I still do now. Everything I did for you and for Lucas came from gratitude, not expectation. Your family gave me a place to rebuild my life when I believed I had nothing left. That gift was already more than enough. Dominic stopped reading for a moment as an unfamiliar ache settled inside his chest. The handwriting felt strangely familiar, almost as though he had imagined those elegant curves countless times without realizing it. He continued, You also told me something else on the evening we sat beside the lake. You said that if your heart ever changed because of pity or obligation, you hoped I would be brave enough to walk away. I promised you that I would. So I am keeping that promise now. I hope one day you find happiness that belongs entirely to you. Do not remember me because you feel responsible. Remember me only if your own heart leads you back. The letter ended with only 2 words. Always grateful. Naomi. Dominic lowered the pages with trembling hands. His eyes drifted toward the nearby shelf where several old photo albums rested beneath a layer of dust. Almost without thinking, he opened one to the middle. Photograph after photograph revealed quiet moments no newspaper would ever have cared about. Lucas blowing out birthday candles while Naomi laughed beside him. Isabella hugging Naomi after a charity event. Samuel teaching Lucas how to polish antique silver while Naomi stood nearby smiling. Then Dominic found one image that stole his breath completely. He and Naomi sat together on the garden bench overlooking the lake, sharing 2 cups of tea beneath the maple trees. Neither of them faced the camera. They were simply talking, smiling with the peaceful comfort of 2 people who no longer needed words to understand each other. There was no distance between them, no hesitation, only trust. Dominic gently touched the photograph before whispering to the empty room, Who were we? A quiet voice answered from the doorway before he even turned around. 2 people who helped each other heal. Naomi stood there holding a basket of freshly folded blankets, unaware that the unopened letter she had written months earlier now rested in Dominic's hands. She saw the pages, then the photograph, and for the first time since returning to the estate, the calm strength she carried every day quietly disappeared from her eyes. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke again. In the silence between them, the truth had finally stepped out of hiding, even though Dominic still remembered almost none of it. Naomi slowly set the basket of blankets on the nearest table, her eyes fixed on the letter resting in Dominic's hands. She had written those words on a sleepless night months before leaving the estate, intending to leave them behind only if fate ever demanded an explanation. She had never found the courage to deliver them. Now fate had done it for her. Dominic looked from the letter to the photograph and finally back to Naomi. His voice was calm, but it carried a quiet vulnerability that no one in the mansion had ever heard before. Tell me one thing, he said softly. Did I ask you to leave? Naomi shook her head. No. Then why did you go? She drew a slow breath, searching for words that would honor both the truth and the promise she had made. Because sometimes loving someone also means protecting the freedom of their future. Dominic frowned gently. That sounds like something I would have argued against. A faint smile appeared on Naomi's face. You did. For a brief moment they both laughed, and the sound echoed gently through the old archive room like a forgotten melody returning home. Then silence settled between them once more. Dominic carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope. You have spent weeks refusing to tell me who I was to you. Naomi lowered her eyes. Because I wanted you to discover who you wanted me to be now, not who I used to be. Her answer lingered in the quiet room. Dominic studied her face, searching not for memory, but for truth. He realized that every person he had questioned had spoken about Naomi's kindness, her patience, her quiet strength, yet she herself had never spoken about her sacrifices even once. That realization moved him more deeply than any forgotten memory could have. The following morning, life inside the mansion continued as usual. Naomi prepared breakfast before sunrise while soft jazz played from the old speaker in the kitchen. Fresh biscuits baked in the oven, coffee filled the room with its rich aroma, and the first rays of sunlight stretched across the marble counters. Dominic entered quietly without announcing himself. He watched Naomi arrange Lucas's favorite blueberry pancakes onto a small white plate before she reached for another skillet. Without thinking, he stepped beside her and opened the cabinet above the refrigerator. His hand reached directly toward a blue ceramic mug hidden behind several others. He placed it beside the coffee pot without hesitation. Naomi stopped moving. That mug had always been his favorite, but after the accident no one had mentioned it. Dominic stared at the cup in confusion. "Why did I choose this one?" he whispered. Naomi could not answer. Instead, she poured fresh coffee into the mug exactly as she had done every morning for years. The aroma drifted upward, warm and familiar. Dominic wrapped both hands around the cup. The porcelain felt strangely comforting against his palms. Then Naomi reached into a small wooden drawer and placed half a teaspoon of cinnamon into the coffee before gently stirring it once clockwise. The tiny silver spoon tapped softly against the ceramic. One delicate sound, one familiar scent, one ordinary morning. Suddenly the world around Dominic seemed to pause. Warm sunlight on the terrace, white orchids blooming beside the windows, Lucas laughing while chasing autumn leaves across the lawn, Naomi humming beside the kitchen counter, two steaming mugs waiting on the garden bench. Countless quiet mornings filled with conversations about hope, forgiveness, and second chances rushed through his mind like pieces of a shattered mirror, finding one another again. His breathing caught. The coffee cup trembled slightly in his hands. Tears filled his eyes before he even understood why. He slowly turned toward Naomi, no longer seeing only the woman who had returned to help him recover. He saw the steady presence that had carried him through lonely days, celebrated small victories, comforted his son, and quietly become the safest place his heart had ever known. Barely above a whisper, with tears beginning to fall freely, he spoke the words Naomi had dreamed of hearing but never expected to hear again. "I remember your song." Naomi stood motionless as the words settled gently between them, carried by nothing more than the quiet morning light and the faint aroma of cinnamon rising from the coffee cup. For weeks she had prepared herself for every possible ending except this one. Dominic was no longer searching. With uncertain eyes, he was looking at her with the same calm warmth that had once transformed an enormous mansion into a place that finally felt like home. Tears slipped silently down Naomi's cheeks, but she made no effort to hide them. Dominic slowly stepped closer, still holding the blue ceramic mug in one hand. "I remember the mornings on the terrace," he whispered. "I remember Lucas pretending he disliked oatmeal until you added fresh strawberries. I remember the music box. I remember the bench by the lake." He paused, his voice trembling with quiet emotion. "And I remember asking you to promise that if I ever lost my way, you would never let gratitude decide our future." Naomi nodded gently. "You asked me to wait until your heart could choose freely." Dominic smiled through his tears. "Then you kept your promise even when it hurt you." Neither of them noticed Isabella and Lucas quietly standing in the kitchen doorway, watching the moment unfold without interrupting it. Samuel appeared a few moments later, removing his glasses as emotion softened the lines across his face. No one spoke. Some moments deserved silence more than applause. Dominic turned toward his family before looking back at Naomi. "There is something I should have said a long time ago." Naomi quietly shook her head. "You do not owe me anything." Dominic smiled with gentle certainty. "That is exactly why I need to say it." Later that afternoon, the entire household gathered beneath the old maple trees overlooking the lake, where autumn leaves drifted across the grass like golden ribbons. It was not a formal event. There were no reporters, no business associates, and no speeches prepared in advance. Only family, lifelong staff members, and the people who had quietly shared the same home for years. Dominic stood beside the familiar wooden bench, resting one hand across its weathered surface before speaking. Most people believe that success is built by the person standing in front, he said. But sometimes the strongest foundation is created by someone standing quietly behind everyone else. His eyes found Naomi. For years, many people introduced her as my housekeeper. Some called her my employee. Others simply called her the maid. He paused as I turned toward Naomi. They were all incomplete descriptions. She became the person who protected peace inside this home without asking for recognition. She gave my son comfort when he needed it most. She reminded my family that kindness belongs in every room. She walked away rather than allow gratitude to become a burden. And even after I forgot her, she chose to protect my freedom instead of claiming her place in my memories. Dominic took one slow step toward her. Everything that remained beautiful in my life was quietly guarded by the woman everyone underestimated. Naomi lowered her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. Dominic smiled gently before offering his hand. I cannot change the months that disappeared from my memory, but I can choose what I remember every day from this moment forward. Naomi accepted his hand with quiet grace. Around them, no one clapped. No one rushed forward. The silence itself became the greatest expression of respect. Lucas wrapped his arms around both of them, laughing through happy tears, while Isabella smiled at Samuel, who simply nodded as though witnessing something he had believed would eventually happen all along. As the sun settled beyond the lake, painting the sky with warm shades of amber and gold, Dominic realized that recovering his memory was never the greatest miracle. The greatest miracle was discovering that genuine love had patiently waited without demanding anything in return. And on that peaceful autumn evening, everyone present remembered that true dignity is never earned through power, wealth, or status. It is revealed by the quiet courage to love, to serve, and to walk away without expecting to be remembered, trusting that one honest heart will always find its way home.